How are all of you doing? It's 2018, which means it's a little bit slow in the video game release calendar. It gives us time to think about some events that we've been to in the past and maybe talk about them a little bit more. One of those that keeps coming up in our conversations is a preview event we went to for Far Cry 5 and some of the things that we didn't talk about the first time around. So we wanted to take the chance to highlight 6 more things that we noticed that you should probably know about Far Cry 5. Joining me is editor Miguel Concepcion.
Hi.
All right, so let's get to the first point, which is the biggest change in this game, the thing that's missing, towers.
Yes, indeed. Towers are gone. Those were a very important component in Far Cry 4. In fact, I had a little bit of a refresher. It was interesting, the flexibility and ways you could take on towers. I was particularly fond of, and I'm going to miss, being able to like get into a gyrocopter and fly directly to the top of a tower, whether I just jump out and wingsuited, or if I just manage to like land the gyrocopter on the tower. Now, there are going to be other ways for you to like reveal the map. We suspect it's going to involve taking over these cultists' outposts.
Yeah, it looks like it's more of a classic Fog of War situation now, where you just talk to people, you explore organically and naturally. That's not to say the elements of towers are gone in this game. There's still a few left that are kind of a nod and a wink, but they don't reveal things around them. But now there's prepper stashes, which go down into the ground instead of up into the sky, and feature some of the puzzles and difficulty that you would have traditionally found in those towers. They're also a place where you will have story exposition and pick up things like perks. So we're curious to see how a Far Cry 5 will feel without just the show you everything around you can do mechanic that previous games have had. So the second thing that we want to talk about is the fact that this game is fully playable in co-op. So in the last one, you could do side missions, but this whole thing can be done as campaign with friends for hire. And the experience of playing with somebody else being, you know, with all the similarities to previous Far Cry games, potentially one of the biggest changes or the biggest draws to Far Cry 5.
I could really see the game sort of catering to different co-op makeups, whether it's like 2 snipers or 2 guys who are just armed to the teeth and are just, you know, charging into outposts. What I'm more curious about is like how, whether or not the game like ramps up or adjusts in difficulty based on whether or not you go solo or co-op.
You and I flew into a equivalent of a heavy base in an airplane and then wingsuited down. One of us went for a tower. The other person went for a dangerous mortar tube at the back of the base. Mm-hmm. That was a huge problem. But that's not to say that later on when you start to unlock things, somebody couldn't just bomb from the air. You can have somebody in an airplane potentially bombing the base while the other person's on the ground, knifing people. There's a lot of potential for ways to tackle missions in that sandbox way that you could only do with side missions in the previous Far Cry.
I think they're counting on fans to be surprised even through failure, and they hopefully will be interested in just like retrying certain outpost invasions multiple times and trying to get it right.
That's a very good point, and that ties into the third thing that we wanted to talk about, which was changes in henchmen. So you had some pretty strong opinions about henchmen and where they are right now in the game versus previous Far Cry titles.
From my vibe, they seemed a lot more aggressive in terms of like encountering them on the road. I mean, we encountered this as far back as Far Cry 3, where they would just pass by you. If you drove fast enough, you wouldn't have to worry about any engagements. But I got the vibe that these enemies in Far Cry 5 are going to be, they might have an opportunity to like deal some damage, and you're going to end up like using one of your health packs because
right as you're just driving by.
Right. In terms of the actual in terms of the actual missions, you did bring up a good point that some of these cultists who are not wearing any armor seem to be very they seem to be quite the bullet sponges, and you make an interesting sort of justification that they just might be like hopped up on painkillers.
So the fourth thing and one of the larger changes that I noticed was a lot more, I don't know if I can call it customization yet because we don't know how much you can tweak vehicles and planes, but there's a huge variety of vehicles, planes, choppers, cars, boats, ATVs, tractors, and there's checkpoints all over the map, airstrips, helicopter pads, and throughout the game you can earn and unlock crazy versions of these. So you rode around in one called the Death Wish car. How did you feel about the variety of vehicles and the crazy versions of those vehicles?
I'm guessing that Ubisoft's mindset is just giving players the flexibility and sort of choice of personal preference. I don't think that it's a case of like trying to make one more vehicle more attractive than the other based on stats. I think they're counting on fans to be drawn in by the different sort of just like styles and aesthetics. That's the vibe I've gotten so far. I got the car by completing a stunt mission. There's a very strong optional racing component, and previous Far Cry games have had this. This one's more sort of sensational because it's sort of an Evel Knievel's inspired. You have to recreate these races that this mythical Daredevil from the 70s that you have to redo. You have to like drive the same routes that he did. I think it's really nice that this game is going to have a ton of vehicles, and the fact that it seems like you're going to be able to have access to a lot of them based on just like how much you could afford and be able to call them in the right places. I think it's going to be it's just going to give the player a lot of options without nerfing the overall experience.
So the fifth thing that we noticed, and this was not very changed from the previous Far Cry, was animal attacks. I didn't see any face-eating eagles, but there were plenty of crazy, insane animals. There were farm animals this time around. We saw like bears fighting farm animals. That felt missing to me in other Ubisoft games. After I played Far Cry titles, I love those immersion experiences where you're about to do something and a bear runs out of the woods and starts just mauling everybody and screwing your plans up.
Right, that's very true. And the fact that I emerged from a forest and found this bull taking on this bear, it sort of just kind of lent some character to the overall world that is basically showing me that all these things are happening regardless of your involvement. So I'm excited about that. I'm glad that there are also still opportunities to free wild animals from their cages and enemy outposts. So I'm hoping to use that strategically.
I will say it's going to be hard for them to compete with Far Cry 4. There was so much personality in riding elephants, you know, random eagle attacks, jaguars. Some of that is here. I didn't see any animals that you could ride, like the elephants. Actually, another good point is the skinning animation wasn't in the game. I don't know if it wasn't there yet in the build that we saw, or you're just not going to skin animals anymore. When you go up to them, you can still pull meat off of them. But when we went through the upgrade tree, it looked like you just bought things. Again, it was a work in progress when we saw it.
Right. I mean, Far Cry 3, even as far back as Far Cry 3, sometimes I would not... I would take a break from story missions because I wanted to focus on not having to worry about my loot capacity. So I would go and open up other areas just so I could find this particular animal that would yield a bigger loot sack.
And the sixth thing that we wanted to talk about was, and it's kind of an unavoidable conversation, but the Ubisoft thing, right? The similarities to other Ubisoft games, particularly seeing elements of Ghost Recon Wildlands. You walk around and you see stuff that you would see in the cartel zones, like hanging dead bodies in the landscape, and even a helicopter puzzle where you had to shoot henchmen in a certain order to steal it.
Yeah, I mean, I see these comparisons, particularly with Wildlands, as a positive. I mean, obviously this game was in development before the release of Wildlands, but Wildlands became one of those successes of 2017. It's developed this really huge following. I mean, things like a lot of air traversal kind of made me think about Wildlands a lot. Also, the progression towards the final boss and having to take out some of the family members reminded me of the path to the main boss in Wildlands, though I suspect it might actually even be maybe like a more concise path in Far Cry 5. And it just speaks overall to, I mean, Ubisoft just, I mean, playing to their strengths. They've, in the past decade, they have evolved into sort of the quote-unquote open world studio. And I think it's worked out for them mostly in positive.
So those were 6 more things you should know about Far Cry 5. Are you seeing big enough differences? Do you just love that thing that Far Cry does in general? Are you sort of burned out on the Ubisoft open world formula? Give us your thoughts in the comments below and we'll talk about it some more. Make sure to stay tuned to GameSpot.com because we're expecting to see more of this game in the future.
And along with Far Cry 5, we've got Metal Gear Survive and Monster Hunter World on the horizon, so we can't wait to talk about those games with you.